and welcome to another AQA GCSE Elizabethan England video. Today's video we're going to try and look at the methods that were used by Elizabethans to deal with the issue of poverty. Just as a quick recap, hopefully you can use the 6 pictures in front of you to remind you of causes of poverty during the Elizabethan era, and remind yourself that this would be a great example to counter that the Elizabethan era was a golden age. A recap on those 6 factors were population increase, poor harvests, debasement of coinage, enclosure, dissolution of the monasteries, swapping from arable crop to pastoral animal farming. Tudor society had a very strict and rigid structure, which was known as the Great Chain of Being. It made it clear to Elizabethans where they were positioned in society. Before Elizabeth's attitude towards those who were poor were very unsympathetic and were set into different categories. The first one being the impotent poor. The impotent poor were those unable to provide for themselves because they were either too young, too old, or too ill to do so. They were not to blame for their situation, and the government was sympathetic towards them. They were considered the deserving poor. But there was also another category within this. They were known as the idle poor. There was a belief in Tudor society that there was an immoral and criminal class, a dishonest section of society of sturdy beggars who genuinely chose this as a way of living and were too lazy to find work. They were considered the undeserving. Now, the big issue for Tudor society and for historians is to try and separate the two. Publications such as Thomas Harmon's Warning Against Vagabonds, which would list all of the different methods that the idle poor would try to trick Tudor society into handing over support, did not help proceedings. Think about how you would separate an impotent poor from an idle poor person. Would you be able to do so? What impact would this have on the general attitude towards the poor in Elizabethan times? This is something to consider quite deeply. Thomas Harmon's publication in 1566, Warning Against Vagabonds, certainly heightened attitudes towards the poor. It is difficult to know how rife the issue of poverty in Elizabethan England was in terms of the genuine and those that were idle. However, his publication had two editions, and we can also suggest that his pamphlet was extremely popular, as there was a legal case against a printing company who were trying to circulate pirated copies of his publication. Here are 4 examples of some of the idle poor that Thomas Harmon warned Tudor society about. The first one is the counterfeit crank. Thomas Harmon goes on to say how the counterfeit crank would deliberately bite down on bars of soap to look like they were frothing at the mouth to try and trick you into handing over your hard-earned money. Secondly, there were gangs such as the Bear-Top Trickster, where a woman might flash and lure a gentleman around the corner, only for him to be attacked by a rival gang and stripped of all of his riches. The Clapperdudgeon would deliberately cover himself in bandages that were already used and looked terrible to try and create greater sympathy. But my favourite has to be Tom O'Bedlam. Tom O'Bedlam would apparently rip the heads off of chickens, stuff them into his ears, and bark at people like a dog until the person submitted and handed over their money. Be careful, according to Thomas Harmon, there be idle poor about. At first, Elizabeth believed she had more important issues than poverty to focus on. She and her government were reluctant to accept that poverty was a national problem and allowed different regions to come up with different solutions. There were lots of local initiatives. York, Ipswich, and Norwich all approached it in similar but also different ways. I think it's important to note that local initiatives were the driving force behind a lot of the movement in national law. Make sure you mention the issuing of licenses, the use of House of Corrections, and the setting up of apprenticeships with the use of local raw materials. I would also pay particular notice to what Norwich did with its taxation, which will prove invaluable later on. Make sure you note down examples from each locality. Your next task is to draw out the following table. We are going to look at what would eventually become national laws introduced by the Elizabethans. Along the x-axis, you need to chart the time, so the year it took place. And along the y-axis, and this is entirely your opinion, I want you to think about how harsh or how lenient these attitudes were towards the Tudors. We will look at the overall pattern once we've gone through all 4 legislations. Make sure you have notes on all 4 law changes as we proceed. The first law was the Statute of Artificers, which was introduced in 1563. This said that all males between the age of 12 and 60, below the rank of gentlemen, were placed under a legal obligation to find employment and to not move from their home parish without permission. Maximum wages were set by justices of the peace in every locality to try and prevent the movement of people, and it was made an offence to pay more than they prescribed. The next law was the Vagabond Act of 1572. This made provisions for the punishment of rogues, vagabonds, and sturdy beggars, who were accused of being responsible for horrible murders, thefts, and other great outrages. They were to be grievously whipped and burnt through the gristle of the right ear with a hot iron. The next act was the 1576 Act. This was modelled on local initiatives like that of Norwich. Town corporations were required to supply the poor with raw materials to keep them profitably employed. A form of apprenticeship, perhaps. Every county was instructed to set up a house of correction where sturdy beggars could be set to work. The house of correction was made deliberately gruesome and vile to try and deter people from taking this as a course of action. The final act is the Act for Relief of the Poor in 1601. After successive poor harvests, the law needed adapting. The new poor law stated that everyone had to pay towards a poor rate. Those who refused to pay the tax could be fined or imprisoned. It ordered every parish to appoint overseers of the poor. The overseer would have a range of responsibilities, ensuring orphans had apprenticeships, provide raw materials for the able-bodied poor in a workhouse, and send the idle poor to the house of correction. So, what can be learned about the Elizabethan attitudes towards the poor? Elizabethan England tried to separate those deserving and undeserving of help. It is therefore difficult for us as historians to work out the extent of idle poor in Elizabethan England. Certainly by 1601, we see the most progressive law introduced in Elizabethan times, which led to the idea of government involvement overseeing local provisions for the poor. This was a form of local tax and could also be used as an example for the Health and the People course. Finally, the issue of poverty is a good example to challenge that the Elizabethan era was a golden age for all. Thanks for listening, and I hope you found this video tutorial extremely beneficial.